All right, today we're going to try and unpack the ideas of a 19th century philosopher who, believe it or not, is shockingly relevant to our world right now. His name is George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, he made some claims that on the surface sound completely wild. But stick with me, because by the end of this, they're going to make a really powerful kind of sense. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's just jump right in with Hegel's two most famous and most confusing statements. First, is art dead? And second, has history already ended? I mean, these sound like total nonsense, don't they? But for Hegel, these were actually dead serious conclusions he drew from watching the world change all around him. So let's try to unpack these two puzzles piece by piece.
So first up, this whole idea about art. Hegel wasn't some fortune teller, but he saw this fundamental shift happening in how we all relate to art, a shift he was convinced was permanent.
Now, when Hegel said this, way back in the early 1800s, he didn't literally mean people were going to stop painting or writing music. Come on. What he meant was that art's job had changed. It could no longer be the main way that humanity grapples with its deepest spiritual questions. That role, he argued, was pretty much over.
And this slide really breaks down that shift perfectly. Just imagine an ancient Greek standing before a huge, awe-inspiring statue of God. That experience is direct, it's emotional, it's almost like a spiritual gut punch. Now, think about us watching a really complex art house film today. We appreciate it, sure, but what's our first instinct? To analyze it, to talk about its themes, to interpret its meaning, to think about it. We've gone from experiencing art as a pure feeling to seeing it as an object for our intellect. For Hegel, things like philosophy had basically taken over the heavy lifting of answering life's big questions.
Okay, so if art's role has fundamentally changed, what about, well, the entire story of humanity? This brings us to Hegel's second, and maybe even more controversial idea, the end of history itself.
And let's be super clear here. Hegel was not saying things would just stop happening, that there'd be no more wars or elections or new gadgets. He was arguing that the big ideas that drive history forward, the epic struggle between monarchy and democracy, freedom and tyranny, had reached their final settled form. The basic questions about how we should organize ourselves as a society, he thought those had been answered. The main plot of the story was basically resolved, even if we were still writing a few extra chapters. So, we've got these two really strange ideas on the table. Art is a thing of the past, and history is already over. They seem totally unrelated and, let's be honest, just plain wrong. But there is a secret key to understanding Hegel, a really unique way of thinking that ties it all together. Right. Now, if you've ever taken a Philosophy 101 class, you probably heard that Hegel's whole deal is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I want you to just take that idea and throw it in the trash. Seriously. It's a massive oversimplification that Hegel himself never even really used. His actual idea is so much cooler and more interesting.
So, welcome to the dialectic. This is a special kind of logic, built for a messy, complicated, always changing world. Unlike regular math where A can never be not A, dialectical logic says, hold on a minute. Contradiction isn't some mistake in our thinking. It's the very engine that makes reality move forward. It's how change happens.
This is such a brilliant way to get it. Mathematically, 1 is always 1. It's static, it never changes. But just think about yourself for a second. Are you the same person you were when you were 5 years old? Well, yeah, of course you are. But at the same time, you're absolutely not, right? You are both the same person and a completely different person. The 5-year-old you is still in there, but you've also grown beyond them. That both-and way of thinking, that's the heart of the dialectic.
So, and this is the crucial part. This isn't just some abstract philosophical game. It's a practical tool. It helps us see how a brand new country can grow out of an old empire, keeping some parts of it while also becoming its total opposite. It lets us trace the messy, contradictory, but ultimately logical path of how things and people become what they are today.
Okay, so how does a tool like this actually apply to our world? For the last few decades, there's been this postmodern idea floating around that the grand narratives, those big sweeping stories of human progress, are basically dead. But if we put on our Hegel glasses, we can actually see a brand new grand narrative unfolding right in front of us. Just look at this timeline. Every single step here makes perfect sense looking back, but it was almost impossible to predict at the time. The personal computer wasn't invented so we could all join Facebook, but it made the internet possible. The internet wasn't built for sharing cat videos, but it led directly to social media. And now, social media, a network of people we actually know, has morphed into something completely different.
This is a perfect example of a dialectical process. It isn't just random chaos, but it's not some pre-written script either. Each new stage grows organically out of the limitations and the hidden possibilities of the one before it. History, it turns out, isn't a straight line. It's more like a process of self-discovery, unfolding in ways no one could have seen coming.
And this, right here, is the critical point for us today. The change from classic social media, where you mostly saw stuff from your friends, to what we have now, recommendation media, where an AI is curating your entire feed, well, that is a profound dialectical leap. We are living through a massive, fundamental change in the very fabric of information and culture.
So what does this all mean for us? Are we just helpless cogs in some giant historical machine, just watching a story that's already been written? Well, according to Hegel, not even close. This is probably the most important thing to take away from all this. The dialectic is not a crystal ball. It's more like a really good pair of glasses that helps us look backwards and understand the strange logic of how we got to this exact moment. It can't tell us what's on the next page of the story, because that page hasn't been written yet.
I just love this metaphor. It captures the feeling of being alive right now so perfectly. We are not just passengers sitting back and watching history happen. We are standing right on the bow of the ship, sailing into a totally unknown horizon. We can look back and see the wake. We can make sense of the journey so far. But what lies ahead is an open sea.
So this common idea that Hegel's philosophy is all about destiny and leaves no room for human freedom, it's just a big misunderstanding. The reality is actually way more exciting. The story isn't finished. Our actions, our ideas, our struggles, that's what's going to write the next chapter. We have agency. And that's really where this leaves us. Hegel gives us these amazing tools to read the book of history and actually make sense of all its bizarre plot twists. We are living inside that book. Right now, we are the authors of this chapter. So the big question he leaves for us isn't what happened, but what are we going to do next?